What if I told you that almost half of what you think each day isn't true? You trust your mind, but it's full of traps, false memories, hidden biases and shortcuts that bend reality without you noticing. Welcome to Neuroscience Academy. Tonight we'll explore 101 mind traps that fool your brain every day. And the first mystery is this: your brain isn't built for truth, it's built for speed, which means it constantly takes invisible shortcuts. Your brain, as vast and powerful as it seems, is not designed for perfect accuracy. It is designed for efficiency, for speed, for survival, and that means it constantly takes shortcuts. This is where we begin with the first of many illusions that quietly shape your every thought. And here, I want you to notice something. This is our first great data point, the first clue in the collection of 101. Your brain relies on cognitive shortcuts, mental pathways that let you leap to conclusions without spending much effort. They save time, but they also bend the truth. Imagine trying to cross a busy street. You don't calculate the exact speed of each car, you just sense a gap and step forward. That is the shortcut at work. It feels natural, almost flawless, but the same mental habit that protects you in traffic also misleads you in more subtle situations, like when you assume someone's silence means disapproval, or when you make a decision in seconds that really deserved more thought. Why does your mind fall into this pattern? Because thinking is expensive. Every neuron firing costs energy, and your brain already consumes a fifth of everything your body produces. So rather than burn fuel on every small choice, it leans on shortcuts. They are fast, they are automatic, and they feel right, but they are not always true. And here we find the paradox. The very design that allows you to survive also guarantees that you will be deceived by your own thoughts. And this leads us gently into the second fact in our journey. Your mind is a relentless pattern seeker. It does not rest with random events or unconnected details. It stitches them together, even when no real thread exists. Have you ever looked at clouds and seen a face, or heard your phone buzz when it was silent? This is called the illusory pattern instinct, and it reveals something profound about your inner world. Long ago, this tendency helped our ancestors survive. Better to mistake the rustling of leaves for a predator than to ignore danger and perish. The cost of a false alarm was small. The cost of missing the signal was deadly. But today, this same wiring makes you believe in lucky numbers, superstitions, and hidden meanings that aren't there. And it can even make you fall prey to conspiracy theories, because the brain feels safer believing in a secret order than accepting chaos. Notice how this builds on the first idea. Shortcuts save energy, and one of the most powerful shortcuts is pattern making. When you see shapes in shadows, or coincidences that feel like destiny, you're experiencing the old machinery of survival whispering in your modern mind, and that whisper is convincing, almost irresistible. You don't just think you see a pattern, you feel it. The certainty comes not from logic, but from emotion dressed as logic. Now, let's step into our third key insight. If shortcuts and patterns dominate your thought, it is because your brain is obsessed with saving energy. This is not just preference, it is biology. Your neurons fire with electricity and chemicals, and each connection costs glucose, oxygen, and time, so the brain is always looking for ways to minimize work. Scientists call this cognitive economy. You might call it laziness, but it is more precise than that. It is efficiency at all costs. Consider reading your eyes jump in rapid saccades, and your brain fills in the gaps. You don't actually see every word, but you feel like you do. That gap filling saves energy, but it means you can misread or miss details. Another example, when you first learn a skill like driving, it feels exhausting. Every turn, every mirror check demands focus, but soon the skill is automated, moved into unconscious habit. The brain has found a cheaper way to perform the same task. Yet in this energy-saving process, errors multiply. You can drive on autopilot and miss a red light, or assume you've locked the door when you haven't. The efficiency that frees your mind also blinds it. Reflect on what this means for life. If your deepest organ is always negotiating between accuracy and economy, then much of what you know is a compromise. You live not with perfect truth, but with a version of reality that costs less fuel. And this awareness can soften how harshly you judge yourself. The mistakes you make are not failures of character, they are natural byproducts of a brain doing its best to conserve. Now let's lean toward the fourth trap, one that might surprise you because it feels like the opposite of error. It is the illusion of obviousness. Have you ever learned something new and then immediately thought, "Of course, that makes perfect sense. I should have known it all along"? That sensation is your brain rewriting the story of discovery. Once you know a fact, it feels self-evident, even though just moments earlier it was hidden. Psychologists call this hindsight bias, but here in its subtle daily form, it is the illusion that truth was always visible. It makes you underestimate how difficult problems really are, because from the far side of the answer, the path looks straight. This illusion affects not only how you view your own past decisions, but how you judge others. You may think, they should have seen it coming, forgetting how invisible the answer can be until it arrives. These 4 facts, shortcuts, patterns, energy saving, and the illusion of obviousness are the foundation of the traps that follow. Together, they form the silent architecture of daily thought. You might not notice them, but they shape everything you perceive and believe, and once you begin to see them, you cannot unsee them. The world appears not as solid truth, but as a dance between efficiency and error, speed and distortion. And here is where the intrigue deepens. Because if your brain begins with such fragile tools, what happens when those tools collide with confidence? What happens when the mind that saves energy also believes too strongly in its own judgment? That is the doorway we are about to open. Confidence can feel like clarity. When your thoughts carry a sharp edge, when your voice feels certain, your whole body leans into the belief that you are right, and yet certainty is not the same as truth. This brings us to another one of our great discoveries, the next data point in our journey, the bias of overconfidence. Human beings, across cultures, consistently overestimate the accuracy of their judgments. You may believe you know more than you do, or that your prediction is stronger than it really is. In fact, when tested, people who express the most confidence are often no more correct than those who admit uncertainty, and still, the sensation of confidence is persuasive. It convinces not only others but also yourself. Think of how this plays out in simple tasks. A student who feels absolutely certain about an exam answer may still be wrong. An investor convinced that a stock cannot fail may misjudge risk entirely. The overconfidence bias is powerful because it feels good. It cushions doubt, giving you the illusion of mastery, but mastery is not guaranteed, and here we find the paradox. Your conviction can be strongest at the very moment your accuracy is weakest. That paradox deepens with the next trap, and it deserves to be called out directly. Here we uncover another of our striking facts, known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. This cognitive error shows that people with the least skill in a field often overestimate their competence the most. In experiments, students who performed in the lowest quartile on tests often believed they had scored above average. Why? Because lacking the skill to perform also means lacking the skill to recognize your mistakes. The mind does not see what it cannot measure, so the less you know, the more you might believe you know. This trap hides not only in classrooms but in workplaces, debates, and everyday conversations. The Dunning-Kruger effect explains why someone with shallow understanding might speak with the loudest certainty, while those who truly grasp complexity may hesitate, aware of what remains unknown. Reflect on this for a moment. Overconfidence and Dunning-Kruger form a pair of illusions. One makes you inflate your accuracy, and the other hides the depth of your ignorance. Together, they can fool even the most well-intentioned person, and when these illusions collide with planning for the future, they set the stage for another bias that quietly shapes daily life. Here enters another of our important data points, the planning fallacy. You might already feel its effect in your own routines. Projects, deadlines, chores. Again and again, you expect them to take less time than they really do. Students underestimate how long essays will require. Builders underestimate how long construction will last. Even governments misjudge how long major projects like railways or airports will take. Decades of research show the same conclusion. People consistently predict faster completion than reality delivers, and it happens even when they have direct evidence from past failures. The planning fallacy reveals a blind spot. You imagine best-case scenarios and quietly push aside the obstacles. Your inner clock is biased toward optimism, and optimism itself is the root of another trap. Let's mark it clearly, because this is another one of the essential facts on our path, the optimism bias. At its core, it is the tendency to expect positive outcomes more often than is realistic. People believe they are less likely than others to suffer accidents, illnesses, or failures. They imagine they will be luckier, healthier, or more successful than statistics suggest. This bias can be protective. It fuels ambition, resilience, and hope, but it also blinds you to risk. A driver may speed, convinced an accident will not happen to them. A smoker may minimize health risks, certain that cancer is for other people. Optimism bias turns probability into wishful thinking. Consider how these four traps interact. Overconfidence tells you that you know enough. Dunning-Kruger hides the depth of what you don't know. The planning fallacy assures you tasks will unfold faster than they will, and optimism bias wraps all of it in the warm glow of everything will be fine. It is easy to see why human beings fall into mistakes again and again. These errors are not isolated, they reinforce each other. Together, they create a mental world where certainty feels stronger than caution, and the future feels brighter than the evidence supports. Philosophically, this cluster of illusions reveals something profound about the human condition. To live without confidence would be unbearable. To plan without optimism would paralyze you. These traps, though they distort truth, also give you the courage to act. Imagine a life without them. You would never begin a project, never take a risk, never believe love or work or discovery could succeed. Perhaps the brain in its wisdom favors usefulness over accuracy, and so it dresses hope as certainty, disguises ignorance as knowledge, and paints the future in brighter colors than reality will allow. But awareness of these biases is not meant to strip you of hope. Instead, it offers a balance. When you recognize overconfidence, you can pause and question, am I sure? Or does it just feel good to be sure? When you notice the Dunning-Kruger effect, you can remind yourself that confidence and competence are not the same. When you see the planning fallacy, you can adjust by doubling your estimate, not because you are weak, but because the mind's clock runs fast. And when optimism bias tempts you to ignore risk, you can allow yourself hope while still preparing for difficulty. These reflections bring us to a quiet turning point. We began with shortcuts and patterns, and now we see how those shortcuts feed into confidence. The brain saves energy by simplifying, but simplification breeds illusion, and illusions become stronger when wrapped in certainty. So here, at the end of this section, we pause with a question. If your confidence can be so fragile, what happens when it collides with memory, the one thing you trust to hold your life together? One of the most subtle illusions the brain creates is the feeling of being observed. You walk into a room, stumble slightly, and immediately believe everyone noticed. You make a small mistake in speech and feel certain that it echoed in the minds of those around you. This brings us to another of our remarkable findings, one of the growing collection of data points we are quietly gathering together, the spotlight effect. It describes how you consistently overestimate how much others notice your actions, your appearance, or your mistakes. Experiments show that when people wear a shirt with a large, embarrassing image, they expect most of the room to notice. In reality, only a small fraction actually does. Your brain, however, tells you the spotlight is burning brightly on you. Why does this illusion exist? The explanation is simple. You live inside your own perspective, and from inside, everything you do feels central. Your mind mistakes the intensity of your own awareness for the attention of others. It is as though you are standing on a stage, convinced the audience follows every gesture, when in truth, most people are absorbed in their own performance. Recognizing this trap can soften your fears. The world is rarely watching as closely as you believe. From this flows another related error, and it deserves to be named as one of our key discoveries tonight, the illusion of transparency. If the spotlight effect makes you think others see more of you than they do, the illusion of transparency makes you think others can read your inner states more clearly than they actually can. For example, when you are nervous, you believe it is obvious to everyone. When you lie, you fear that your guilt shines through your eyes. In truth, studies show that your internal emotions leak far less than you assume. Observers are poor at detecting lies, poor at sensing anxiety, and poor at reading the depth of feelings, yet inside your own body, the emotions feel overwhelming, so your brain assumes they must be visible. Together, these two illusions create a strange world. You believe others notice your mistakes and read your feelings, while in reality, they barely register either. This gap between perception and reality shapes how you interact. You may withdraw when anxious, fearing exposure, or over-apologize for errors no one saw. These are small distortions, but repeated daily, they guide your life in invisible ways. Now let us shift toward another of our major data points, one that touches not on embarrassment, but on self-image, the false uniqueness effect. Where the spotlight effect makes you believe you are too visible, the false uniqueness effect makes you believe you are more different from others than you really are. People often think their abilities, values, or preferences are rare. You may believe your moral choices are special, or that your lifestyle sets you apart, But when researchers measure these beliefs, they find that many people share the same traits, values, and choices. The illusion of uniqueness is comforting. It preserves a sense of identity. It makes you feel distinctive, yet it quietly disconnects you from recognizing the common human ground you share with others. There is beauty and risk in this illusion. Beauty, because it strengthens self-worth and allows you to carry pride in who you are. Risk, because it can isolate you, convincing you that no one else could understand your struggles or choices. Both interpretations spring from the same bias, an overestimation of your uniqueness. From here, let's introduce another one of our insights, continuing the accumulation of facts that build toward our 101, the egocentric bias. This trap appears whenever you assign yourself more centrality than reality grants. In group projects, people often believe they contributed more than they did. In conversations, they overestimate how much their words influenced others. In relationships, they may imagine their role as larger than it truly was. The egocentric bias flows naturally from the way your mind processes experience, because you live from your own vantage point. Every memory is tagged with you at the center, and when the memory is recalled, the central role feels real, even if in the objective story your part was small. What is fascinating is how these four errors link together. The spotlight effect tells you others are watching. The illusion of transparency tells you others can feel your emotions. The false uniqueness effect tells you your qualities stand out in rare ways, and the egocentric bias ties it together, making you the protagonist of every scene. The common thread is self-centered perspective, not selfishness, but the unavoidable fact that you live from within your own mind, and so you mistake your central perspective for universal truth. Philosophically, this cluster of illusions reminds us of the tension between self and other. You are a solitary consciousness experiencing the world from the inside out, and so it is natural to exaggerate your role in it. But step back and you discover a gentler truth. Most people are too occupied with their own inner stage to scrutinize yours. They do not see you as constantly as you imagine. They do not decode your emotions as clearly as you fear. They do not treat your uniqueness as rare as you assume, and they certainly do not place you at the center of every story. Realizing this can be liberating. It can lighten the pressure you place on yourself and soften the judgments you place on others. Yet the question remains, if these illusions inflate your presence in the eyes of others, how do they interact with memory, the storehouse of all the events you believe define you? If your perspective bends the present, can it also bend the past? That is the doorway we now prepare to open. Memory feels like a library. You open a drawer, pull out a file, and expect the story to be waiting exactly as it happened. But the truth is different. The brain does not store experiences like photographs. It rebuilds them each time you recall them. And here surge uno de nuestros grandes datos. Memory reconstruction errors. Every act of remembering is also an act of recreation. Neurons fire, associations connect, and details are filled in. Sometimes they are filled in correctly, sometimes not. Think of it like a painter restoring an old fresco. The brush strokes are guided by fragments of the past, but the colors and shapes are influenced by the present moment. That is why two people can witness the same event and later recall it differently, each feeling absolutely certain. Memory is not a recording, it is a story retold. From this fragile process emerges one of the most fascinating illusions, and yes, it deserves to be marked as another of our essential discoveries, the Mandela Effect. Groups of people confidently remember an event or a detail that never happened. Perhaps they recall a movie line phrased differently, or believe a logo once had an extra shape. In the case that gave this illusion its name, many people around the world insisted they remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison decades before he was actually released. These shared false memories reveal that our minds are not only reconstructive but also suggestible. When enough voices echo the same version, the brain accepts it as truth. The Mandela Effect shows how collective memory can be shaped not by reality but by repetition and belief. Notice how both of these traps, the errors of reconstruction and the Mandela Effect, teach the same lesson. Memory is alive, not fixed. It breathes, shifts, and blends. And it leads us to yet another of our key data points, one that explains why details often slip away from their true origins. This is called source amnesia. It happens when you remember a piece of information but forget where it came from. You may recall a fact, but not the conversation in which you heard it. You may believe a story without knowing whether it was a news article or a friend's rumor. Source amnesia makes the mind vulnerable, because without anchoring the origin, you cannot test the reliability. If a falsehood slips into memory, it can later return as something that feels entirely your own. And from here we reach the fourth element of this cluster, and it too deserves recognition as another one of the growing 101 confabulation. This word describes what happens when the brain unintentionally fabricates details to fill the gaps in memory. It is not lying, because there is no intention to deceive. Instead, the mind feels pressure to provide a coherent story, and so it invents details without awareness that they are false. This phenomenon is often studied in patients with neurological damage, but traces of it exist in all of us. When you tell a story from years ago, you may unconsciously add elements that never occurred, simply because they make the memory smoother, funnier, or more logical. Over time, you yourself come to believe the invented version. Taken together, these four traps, reconstruction errors, the Mandela Effect, source amnesia, and confabulation, reveal the fragility of the very thing you rely on to define yourself. Your identity, your life story, is built on memory, and yet those memories are not pristine recordings but shifting reconstructions, subject to suggestion, distortion, and invention. It is humbling to realize that the most intimate truths you carry may be embroidered with errors. Philosophically, this opens a deep question. If memory is unreliable, what does it mean to know yourself? Perhaps self-knowledge is not about recalling perfect accuracy, but about weaving meaning from imperfect threads. The stories you tell about your past may not be flawless in detail, but they hold truth in the patterns of feeling, in the arcs of change, in the lessons you carried forward. The brain may bend events, but it bends them in ways that preserve coherence, continuity, and survival. Still, awareness of these traps offers a gentle caution. The next time you feel absolutely certain about a past event, pause, ask yourself, is this a memory or a reconstruction? Did I witness it, or did I absorb it from others? Could my mind be filling in gaps without my knowing? Such questions do not erase the memory, but illuminate its complexity. They allow you to hold certainty with humility and doubt with compassion. And this brings us to the cliffhanger that prepares the ground for the next part of our journey. If memory itself can be distorted so easily, what happens when the very numbers, impressions, and first judgments you make in daily life are pulled by invisible weights? That is the doorway we are about to open, where anchors, primacy, and recency take their turn in shaping your world. Numbers have a way of clinging to your mind. Imagine you are asked whether the tallest tree in the world is more or less than 200 feet, and then to guess its actual height. Your estimate will be pulled toward that initial number, even though it was chosen at random. Here encontramos otro de nuestros grandes datos, the anchoring bias. The first figure you see, the first suggestion you hear, even the first impression you form, acts like an anchor. It holds you close, even as you try to drift away toward accuracy. Judges give harsher sentences when asked to spin a wheel with higher numbers beforehand. Shoppers spend more when the original price is listed as high, even if the discount leaves the true cost unchanged. Anchoring is not just about numbers, it is about the mind's need to latch onto something familiar before moving forward. Why does this happen? The brain hates uncertainty. Presented with a question too large or vague, it grasps the first available clue and uses it as a starting point. From there, every adjustment you make is relative, not absolute. You may think you are reasoning freely, but you are really tethered to that first anchor, and once anchored, the mind struggles to let go. This bias reveals itself not only with prices or heights, but also with memory and judgment. Which brings us to another of our significant discoveries tonight, the primacy effect. When you encounter a series of items, say a list of words or the first impressions of new people, the earliest entries tend to dominate your memory. The first information shapes the way you interpret everything that follows. Meeting someone new, the first gestures, the first tone of voice, become the frame through which you filter later behavior. A job candidate who makes a strong first impression benefits disproportionately. Even when later evidence contradicts it, the initial glow remains. But the mind does not only lean toward the first, it also leans toward the last, and so aparece otro de nuestros grandes datos, the recency effect. In a sequence of information, the final items also weigh more heavily. You are more likely to recall the last items on a shopping list, the last arguments in a debate, the last scenes of a film. That is why teachers may remember the performance of their most recent students more clearly, or why a conversation often ends with the flavor of the closing remarks rather than the middle. Memory bends in both directions, toward the beginning and toward the end, leaving the middle less vivid. even if it contained the most substance. Anchoring, primacy, and recency together reveal how fragile judgment is. You may believe you are evaluating information evenly, yet your mind privileges the first and the last, and ties you down to whatever anchor it encountered first. And even when you try to adjust your thinking, you fall into another subtle trap. This one is worth pausing on as another of our essential insights: adjustment bias. Once an anchor is set, people do adjust their estimates, but rarely enough. For example, when guessing the population of a distant city, if the anchor is set at 5 million, your estimate may move up or down, but it will hover too close to that initial figure. The adjustment process is biased. It is insufficient. You may correct, but not fully. Think of the implications. In negotiation, the first number placed on the table steers the entire discussion. In memory, the first and last moments disproportionately shape your sense of the whole. In life, the first story you hear often becomes the anchor for your beliefs, and later information struggles to dislodge it. These are not failures of intelligence. They are reflections of how the brain economizes attention and stores experience. Philosophically, these biases raise an unsettling question. If your mind is so easily pulled by anchors, beginnings, and endings, what does it mean to be fair or objective? Perhaps true objectivity is impossible, because you never perceive information on an even playing field. Instead, you live in a world of weights and tethers, where the sequence of presentation alters the truth you construct. And yet, awareness offers freedom. Knowing the power of anchors, you can resist the first number in negotiation. Knowing the primacy effect, you can revisit first impressions and ask whether they still hold after deeper evidence. Knowing the recency effect, you can give the middle moments of experience more deliberate attention. Knowing adjustment bias, you can push yourself further from the initial estimate, compensating for the mind's tendency to stop too soon. All of these insights remind us that thought is not a neutral canvas, but a landscape shaped by context. And as you recognize this, a new question rises. If your judgments are bent by numbers and order, what happens when your very beliefs are protected by the mind, filtering out anything that might threaten them? That is the trap waiting in the next stage of our journey. Imagine standing before a library with endless shelves, each filled with fragments of information, books, articles, stories, conversations. Now imagine that instead of exploring the whole collection, you only walk down the aisles that already agree with what you believe. This is how the mind often behaves. And aquí aparece otro de nuestros grandes datos, confirmation bias. Your brain has a tendency to search for, notice, and remember information that supports your existing views, while overlooking evidence that challenges them. If you believe a certain food is unhealthy, you'll notice every article that warns against it, while quietly dismissing reports of its benefits. If you trust a political leader, you'll focus on news that praises them, while downplaying scandals or criticisms. Confirmation bias makes the world feel consistent, but it also closes doors to truth. This bias exists because your brain is designed to protect coherence. Holding contradictory ideas is uncomfortable, a state psychologists call cognitive dissonance. To escape that discomfort, your mind selects evidence that fits neatly with your current story. In doing so, it doesn't just filter information, it reshapes reality itself. From here, we step naturally into another illusion that deserves to be named in our growing list: belief perseverance. Even when presented with clear evidence against a belief, people often cling to it. Imagine reading a convincing study that disproves an idea you've long held. For a moment, doubt stirs, but soon you find reasons to discount the study. Perhaps the sample was small, or the methods flawed. The belief survives, protected by your mind's resistance to change. In experiments, people were told false information, then later corrected. Even after acknowledging the correction, traces of the original belief still influence their reasoning. This perseverance shows that beliefs are not just intellectual, they are emotional investments. Letting go of them feels like losing part of yourself. These first two traps, confirmation bias and belief perseverance, work together like armor around your worldview. One filters what comes in, the other protects what is already inside. But the armor has another layer, and it is worth pausing here to highlight it as another of our data points: attentional bias. Your brain gives disproportionate weight to information that aligns with your emotions or priorities. If you are anxious, you will notice threats more readily. If you are in love, you will spot reminders of your partner everywhere. If you are angry, you will lock onto cues that fuel your anger. The world may seem full of dangers or delights, but much of that impression is sculpted by what your attention is trained to seek. Attentional bias narrows the field of perception until it mirrors your inner state. Think of how this affects everyday life. A person struggling with addiction may focus intensely on cues related to the substance, seeing reminders everywhere, unable to look away. Someone grieving may notice every sign of absence, every empty chair, every reminder of loss. Attentional bias doesn't just reflect your emotions, it magnifies them, creating loops that reinforce themselves. And finally, this cluster brings us to another of our essential discoveries, congruence bias. When you test an idea, you often look for evidence that confirms it rather than evidence that might disprove it. Imagine suspecting that a colleague dislikes you. You pay attention to every frown, every short reply, every moment of silence, interpreting them as proof. Rarely do you test the alternative, searching for signs of kindness or considering that their mood has nothing to do with you. Congruence bias narrows your experiments, keeping you locked in a cycle where your assumptions shape the evidence you notice. Together, these four traps form a fortress around belief. Confirmation bias filters incoming information. Belief perseverance cements what is already accepted. Attentional bias steers your focus toward what matches your mood. Congruence bias restricts your testing to only one side of the story. The result is a mind that feels rational while quietly defending itself from contradiction. Philosophically, this raises a haunting thought. Do we ever see reality as it is, or only as it agrees with us? Perhaps truth is always filtered, always softened by the comfort of coherence. And yet, this is not necessarily a flaw. It is a mechanism that has kept humanity stable, preventing collapse under constant doubt. To believe, even imperfectly, allows action. To hold on to stories, even partial ones, allows continuity. The danger lies not in having these biases, but in forgetting that they exist. When you remember them, you gain perspective. You can notice when you are reading only sources that agree with you. You can pause when you feel defensive about a belief and ask, am I preserving truth or just protecting myself? You can widen your attention to include what your emotions try to exclude. You can test not only the evidence that agrees but the evidence that challenges. And here the path bends once again. If the mind protects its belief so fiercely, what happens when it extends that protection to the people you encounter? When charm, beauty, or familiarity distort judgment itself? That is where our next journey will lead, into the glow and shadow of the halo effect. When you meet someone for the first time, your impression feels instant, almost effortless. A smile, a tone of voice, a posture, it all blends into a rapid judgment. Aquí se esconde otro de nuestros grandes datos, the halo effect. This bias makes a single positive trait, such as attractiveness or charm, spill over into unrelated judgments. If a person looks confident, you may assume they are competent. If they are kind, you may believe they are also intelligent. Your mind builds an entire constellation of qualities from one bright star. The halo feels natural, yet it bends truth by turning one trait into a disguise for many. This illusion is powerful in daily life. Teachers often give higher grades to students they find likable. Employers judge candidates more favorably if their first impression is warm. Even in courtrooms, defendants perceived as attractive are less likely to receive harsh sentences. The halo effect shapes not only how you see others, but how opportunities and outcomes unfold around them. But if light can distort, so can shadow. Aquí aparece otro de nuestros grandes hallazgos, the horn effect. It is the mirror of the halo. A single negative trait, perhaps a mistake, an awkward gesture, or an unpleasant habit, casts a long shadow over unrelated qualities. If someone is rude once, you may judge them as incompetent in all areas. If they make a poor first impression, you may struggle to see their later kindness. The horn effect demonstrates how one flaw can eclipse many strengths. Together, halo and horn build a fragile framework for human judgment. Instead of weighing each trait separately, your brain paints with broad strokes, either glowing with light or darkening with shadow. This shortcut simplifies the complexity of people, but at the cost of fairness. And yet the story deepens with another of our important data points, the beauty bias. Human beings consistently attribute positive qualities to those who are physically attractive. This is not merely cultural, it has been documented across societies. Attractive individuals are often perceived as more intelligent, more trustworthy, and even more moral. The irony is that physical appearance says nothing about these traits, yet the brain feels convinced. Advertisers exploit this bias, pairing products with attractive faces. Politicians benefit from it, gaining votes simply from a polished appearance. The beauty bias is subtle, but it seeps into decisions at every level. Why does the mind fall for it? Evolutionary psychology offers one explanation. In ancestral environments, certain physical traits may have been linked with health or fertility, making them valuable cues for survival. Today, those ancient cues persist, even when they no longer carry the same meaning. The brain continues to reward beauty with trust and admiration, even though logic warns otherwise. Finally, we reach another of our discoveries, one that feels gentler but is no less influential. The familiarity heuristic. Things that feel familiar are judged as safer, truer, and more reliable than those that are strange or new. A song you've heard before seems better than an unfamiliar one. A brand you recognize feels more trustworthy than one you've never seen. Faces that resemble people you know spark a sense of comfort. Familiarity acts as a shortcut, signaling safety, even when the reality behind it is unknown. Consider how these four illusions intertwine. The halo effect turns one bright trait into many. The horn effect lets one shadow darken the whole. The beauty bias awards unearned qualities to attractiveness. The familiarity heuristic crowns what is known with the title of trustworthy. Together, they sculpt how you perceive others before you even know them. Your brain whispers judgments within seconds, and those judgments color every interaction that follows. Philosophically, this cluster of biases reveals how thin the line is between truth and perception in human relationships. We often speak of knowing someone, but what we know is filtered through these illusions. You may think you admire someone for their wisdom, when in truth it was their beauty that first tilted your judgment. You may think you distrust someone for their character, when it was only a single flaw that cast a shadow. You may think you prefer one choice over another because it is better, when in reality it is simply more familiar. Awareness of these traps allows for compassion. If judgments are so fragile, then perhaps it is wise to hold them lightly, to pause before praising too quickly or condemning too harshly, to ask what part of this impression is real and what part is just the glow of the halo, the weight of the horn, the pull of beauty, or the comfort of familiarity. And as this section closes, we step toward a new frontier of distortion, one that is not about first impressions or appearances, but about the deep fear of losing what we already have. For if beauty and charm can sway the heart, loss has the power to dominate the mind. Imagine you are holding a coin in your hand. If you lose it, the pain you feel is sharper than the pleasure of gaining the same coin. This simple imbalance brings us to otro de nuestros grandes datos, loss aversion. Research shows that the human mind reacts about twice as strongly to losing as to winning. Losing $10 feels worse than gaining $10 feels good. This bias influences decisions far beyond money. People stay in unhappy jobs because leaving feels like losing stability. They cling to relationships that no longer serve them because separation feels like losing love, even when what remains is only habit. Loss aversion tilts your inner scales so heavily toward fear of losing that it quietly reshapes how you live. Why does the brain work this way? Evolution may hold the answer. For our ancestors, losing resources, food, shelter, safety, often meant death. Gaining was pleasant, but not as critical as avoiding loss. This survival wiring remains active long after the environment has changed. You might not be fighting for survival in the wilderness, but your mind still treats small losses as grave dangers. From here, another bias unfolds, and CV merece ser marcado como uno más de nuestros grandes hallazgos, the endowment effect. Once you own something, you value it more than you did before. A coffee mug feels ordinary until it is yours, then its worth doubles in your perception. Experiments show that people demand more money to give up an object they own than they would ever pay to acquire it in the first place. Ownership changes value, not in reality but in the mind. The endowment effect explains why we hoard possessions, why letting go of clutter feels painful, and why even small items feel infused with significance once they belong to us. This tendency links closely to another trap, and aquí tenemos otro de nuestros descubrimientos esenciales, the status quo bias. The mind prefers the familiar state of things and resists change, even when the change may be beneficial. Staying with the default option feels safer. People stick with old technologies, outdated services, or even harmful habits, simply because moving away from the current state feels like loss. The status quo bias blends with loss aversion, creating a double pull. Losing what you have feels painful, and leaving the familiar feels dangerous. Together, they hold you in place. But the most powerful of these forces may be the one we often overlook, and es importante subrayarlo como otro de los datos que completan nuestro recorrido, the negativity bias. Human beings notice and remember negative experiences more than positive ones. One harsh word outweighs many compliments. A single mistake can eclipse years of good behavior. News outlets know this instinctively. Bad news captures more attention because your brain evolved to prioritize threats. This bias explains why arguments linger in memory longer than reconciliations, and why you may replay painful moments far more than joyful ones. Negativity imprints itself deeply, while positivity fades quickly. Taken together, these four traps, loss aversion, the endowment effect, status quo bias, and negativity bias, form a web of resistance. They make you cling to what you have, fear what you might lose, prefer the familiar over the new, and dwell more on pain than on joy. They tilt your life toward caution, sometimes wisely, sometimes unnecessarily. Philosophically, these biases reveal the weight of fear in human existence. To be human is to feel the shadow of potential loss hanging over every gain, yet in this shadow lies both suffering and strength. Loss aversion may keep you from reckless risks. The endowment effect may deepen your appreciation for what you own. The status quo bias may preserve traditions that give stability, and the negativity bias, though heavy, may protect you by ensuring that threats are never ignored. Still, awareness offers a way to loosen the grip. When you feel the sting of loss, you can remind yourself that the intensity is disproportionate. When you overvalue what is yours, you can test whether the attachment is rational or just a trick of ownership. When you resist change, you can ask if the status quo truly serves you or if fear is holding you still. And when negativity clouds your memory, you can deliberately focus on gratitude, balancing the record with what is easily forgotten. And so, as we close this section, the path bends again. If fear of loss dominates the mind, what happens when the brain goes in the opposite direction, convincing you that you control more than you actually do? That is the illusion awaiting us next, where chance and control blur together in the quiet theater of the mind. You shuffle a deck of cards, roll a pair of dice, or press the button of a slot machine. None of these actions change the underlying randomness, but somehow it feels as if they do. Aquí comenzamos con otro de nuestros grandes datos, the illusion of control. This bias makes you believe you can influence outcomes that are purely determined by chance. People throw dice harder when they want a high number and softer when they want a low one, as though their gestures could persuade probability. Lottery players often choose their own numbers, convinced that personal choice increases their chances of winning, even though every ticket has the same odds. The illusion of control comforts you, offering the feeling of agency in a world that is often uncertain. Why does this illusion persist? Because control feels safe. To imagine that your actions shape events reduces anxiety, even if the belief is false. Experiments show that people prefer to press the button themselves rather than let a machine do it, even when both lead to the same random result. The brain favors the comfort of influence over the reality of randomness. From here emerges another bias, closely related, and mira ser nombrado claramente como otro de nuestros descubrimientos, the clustering illusion. Human beings see patterns in random data, believing that streaks or clusters mean something when they do not. Imagine tossing a coin and getting 5 heads in a row. Most people feel that a tail is now due, but probability does not work that way. Each toss is independent, yet the human brain struggles to accept pure randomness. Clusters of coincidences feel like signals, as if the universe were sending a hidden message. In truth, randomness naturally produces streaks, but the mind interprets them as meaningful because it was designed to find patterns, even when they aren't there. This sets the stage for another famous distortion, and sí, lo subrayamos como otro gran dato en nuestro camino, the hot hand fallacy. In sports, when a player makes several successful shots in a row, spectators, and even the player themselves believe the streak will continue, that the hand is hot. The same illusion arises in gambling. A string of wins feels like evidence of skill or momentum, yet statistics show that each attempt remains independent. A basketball shot after 3 successful ones is no more likely to go in than after 3 misses. Still, the hot hand fallacy persists because it aligns with human intuition. We want skill and success to flow in streaks, not to be swallowed by randomness. Finally, let us step into another realm of distorted belief, one that reaches beyond numbers and games. Aquí tenemos otro de los datos esenciales de esta colección, magical thinking. This bias occurs when you believe that your thoughts, words, or rituals can influence external events in ways that defy logic. Children often believe their wishes can shape reality, but traces of magical thinking remain in adulthood. Knocking on wood, wearing a lucky shirt, or avoiding jinxes are all examples. Even highly rational people sometimes feel uneasy when breaking a superstition, as if the thought itself had power. Magical thinking provides comfort and a sense of order, especially in moments of uncertainty. These four illusions, the sense of control where none exists, the search for clusters in chaos, the belief in streaks of success, and the quiet pull of magical rituals, show how deeply the brain resists randomness. Human beings crave order, crave meaning, crave the assurance that their actions matter. And so even when faced with pure chance, the mind creates stories of influence, patterns, and hidden connections. Philosophically, this reveals a paradox of human existence. The same tendencies that lead to these biases also fuel creativity, art, and spirituality. Magical thinking, while irrational, gives rise to rituals that strengthen community. The clustering illusion, though false in science, allows us to see beauty in constellations of stars. The illusion of control motivates us to take action, even in uncertain conditions. In this sense, errors of thought are not only flaws, they are also the seeds of meaning. Yet awareness remains vital. Knowing these biases exist helps you step back. The next time you feel luck guiding your hand, you can pause and recognize the trick of probability. The next time you believe a streak guarantees continuation, you can remind yourself of independence. The next time superstition whispers in your ear, you can smile at the brain's need for comfort without letting it dictate your choices. And now we turn toward another cluster of illusions. If randomness confuses the mind, what happens when past investments, time, effort, money, tie us down, even when letting go would be wiser? That is the trap waiting in our next step, the sunk costs of the human heart and mind. Picture this: you buy a ticket for a concert, but when the night arrives, you feel exhausted. The logical choice would be to rest at home, yet you still drag yourself to the venue, telling yourself you must go because the ticket was expensive. Aquí tenemos otro de nuestros grandes datos, the sunk cost fallacy. It is the tendency to continue investing in something simply because you have already spent time, money, or energy on it, even when the rational decision would be to walk away. People stay in failing businesses, unhealthy relationships, or dead-end projects, not because they are working, but because they cannot bear to admit the past investment is gone. The truth is that costs already paid cannot be recovered, yet the mind weighs them heavily, making you chase losses instead of cutting them. This fallacy blends easily into a broader phenomenon, and mira ser señalado como otro de nuestros hallazgos importantes, escalation of commitment. Once you begin a path, especially one that requires effort and sacrifice, you feel compelled to continue, even when evidence shows it is failing. Military strategies persist long after failure is clear, simply because so much has been invested. Companies pour resources into doomed projects, unwilling to abandon what they have already built. The deeper the hole, the more you dig, convinced that persistence will eventually pay off. Escalation of commitment is the sunk cost fallacy magnified, binding you to decisions long after logic suggests release. But the human mind doesn't only cling to losses, it also inflates the value of its own creations. Aquí surge otro de nuestros datos clave, the IKEA effect. Named after the furniture store, it describes how people value objects more when they assemble them themselves. A bookshelf you build, however uneven, feels more precious than a perfect one you bought ready-made. The act of effort transforms perception of value. This bias extends beyond objects. You may overvalue an idea simply because it is yours, or prefer a solution you worked hard on, even if another is objectively better. The IKEA effect reflects the deep connection between effort and meaning in the human mind. Closely tied to this is another bias worth marking in Nuestra Lista de 101, effort justification. When you put energy into something, your mind convinces you that it was worthwhile, even if the outcome is disappointing. People who undergo difficult initiation rituals value the group more highly. Students who study excessively for a poor lecture convince themselves they learned something valuable. The harder the path, the more the result feels worth it, even when reality suggests otherwise. This bias comforts you, transforming suffering into significance. Consider how these four illusions weave together. The sunk cost fallacy keeps you tied to past investments. Escalation of commitment pushes you deeper into failing paths. The IKEA effect makes your creations shine brighter than they really do. and effort justification rewrites pain into meaning. Together, they form a pattern. The human brain hates waste. It transforms time, energy, and struggle into value, whether or not value truly exists. Philosophically, this cluster speaks to something tender in human life. We long for our efforts to matter. We cannot bear the thought that years of work, love, or sacrifice were meaningless, and so the mind obliges, creating illusions that preserve dignity and purpose. These biases, while deceptive, protect the soul from despair. A failed relationship is reframed as "at least I tried." A lost investment is softened by the idea that persistence was noble. Even suffering gains a glow, as if the hardship itself proves the worth of what was pursued. Yet awareness offers liberation. Recognizing the sunk cost fallacy allows you to step away sooner, before more energy is wasted. Naming escalation of commitment helps you question whether persistence is strength or simply blindness. Understanding the IKEA effect lets you ask whether your attachment is to the object itself or to your effort, and noticing effort justification encourages you to separate true value from invented comfort. To see these traps clearly is not to diminish your efforts but to honor them honestly. Sometimes, letting go is the most courageous act. Sometimes, admitting waste prevents deeper loss, and sometimes, separating value from effort allows you to appreciate what is truly meaningful rather than what simply demanded labor. As this section closes, the path opens again. If sunk costs and effort tie you to the past, what happens when the way information is framed, when the very packaging of choices alters your decisions, even when the facts remain the same? That is the landscape we are about to enter, where words and frames reshape reality itself. Imagine a doctor telling you that a medical procedure has a 90% survival rate. You feel reassured, almost comforted by the number. But now imagine the same doctor telling you instead that the procedure carries a 10% chance of death. The facts are identical, yet your reaction shifts dramatically. Aquí aparece otra de nuestros grandes datos, the framing effect. The way information is presented, its frame changes how you perceive and decide, even when the underlying reality has not changed. Politicians use this bias to influence opinion, advertisers to shape desire, and negotiators to tilt outcomes. You may think you are responding to facts, but in truth, you are responding to frames. The framing effect reveals how delicate perception is. The mind does not process information neutrally. It absorbs tone, emphasis, and context. A decision that feels wise in one frame may feel reckless in another. This illusion is not about numbers alone. It extends to words, metaphors, and images. Call a tax a burden, and it feels heavy. Call it a contribution, and it feels noble. The frame whispers into judgment long before reason has its say. Connected to this is another of our essential discoveries, and me se destacado en nuestra colección, the bias of risk aversion versus risk seeking. When a situation is framed in terms of potential gains, people tend to avoid risks, preferring secure outcomes. But when the same situation is framed in terms of potential losses, people become more willing to gamble, to risk it all for a chance to avoid the pain of losing. Imagine being told you have $1,000 and can choose between keeping $500 for sure or flipping a coin to win or lose it all. Most prefer the certainty of keeping $500. Now imagine the reverse. You are told you will lose $1,000 unless you gamble. Many will take the risky bet, even though the math is identical. Gain frames promote caution. Loss frames invite risk. This shift reveals the emotional heart of decision-making. Rationally, the numbers are equal, but emotionally, gain feels fragile and loss feels unbearable. The framing of the situation determines whether you shield yourself or leap into risk. Another subtle variation of framing brings us to otro de nuestros grandes hallazgos, attribute framing. This bias occurs when the description of qualities alters perception, even when the qualities themselves are unchanged. Ground beef labeled 75% lean feels healthier than beef labeled 25% fat. A glass described as half full feels more optimistic than one half empty. Attribute framing hides no new information, it simply colors the same data in different emotional tones. Yet those tones are powerful enough to sway decisions in health, law, and daily life. And finally, we arrive at another bias in this family of distortions, uno más que se suma a nuestra serie de 101, the pseudo-certainty effect. This occurs when people treat uncertain outcomes as if they were certain, especially when decisions are framed in stages. For example, imagine a two-step lottery where winning the first round gives you a 50% chance at a final prize. When offered a way to secure that second round, people often treat the 50% chance as guaranteed, ignoring that uncertainty still exists in the first stage. The frame of certainty feels so appealing that it overrides logic. In daily life, this effect shows up in insurance choices, where people overpay to eliminate small risks, treating reduced risk as absolute safety. Together, these four traps, the framing effect, risk aversion and seeking, attribute framing, and pseudo-certainty, demonstrate the power of context. The mind does not read numbers and words as neutral. It tastes their flavor, absorbs their tone, and lets the presentation outweigh the substance. Philosophically, this cluster reminds us that reality is never raw. It always arrives wrapped in language, perspective, and framing. Every story you hear, every choice you face, every number you weigh, comes through a filter. To live wisely is not to escape framing, but to notice it, to pause and ask, is it the fact that convinces me, or the way the fact is told? And so, as we close this section, we prepare to step further into the tricks of memory and judgment. If framing can distort your choices, what happens when availability itself, what simply comes to mind most easily, takes control of your truth? That is the question waiting in the next stage of our journey. When you try to judge how likely something is, your mind often turns not to statistics, but to memory. If examples come to mind easily, you assume they must be common. Aquí tenemos otro de nuestros grandes datos, the availability heuristic. After seeing news about plane crashes, you may feel flying is more dangerous than it really is. After hearing about burglaries, you may fear your neighborhood is unsafe, even if crime rates are low. The mind equates vividness with frequency, accessibility with truth. The more easily something surfaces in your memory, the more real it feels. This bias is rooted in the architecture of thought. Retrieving memories requires effort, and the brain treats ease of recall as a shortcut for likelihood. But memory is uneven. Shocking events, emotional stories, and vivid images return quickly, while ordinary, boring, or positive experiences fade. Thus, your perception of reality is tilted by what is memorable, not by what is most accurate. From this shortcut flows another illusion. Sí, merece estar marcado como otro de nuestros grandes descubrimientos, the fluency effect. Information that is easy to process feels more true than information that is complex or difficult. A statement written in clear font seems more believable than the same statement in a hard-to-read script. A rhyme or slogan feels truer than a complicated explanation. Advertisers know this well. Catchy phrases lodge in memory and feel reliable simply because they are fluent. Your brain mistakes ease of processing for truth, merging beauty of form with accuracy of content. Closely connected is another distortion, and aquí aparece otro de los datos clave en nuestra lista de 109, salience bias. The mind gives disproportionate attention to what is most noticeable, even when it is irrelevant. Imagine watching a group of people pass a ball while someone in a gorilla costume walks across the scene. Many fail to notice the gorilla at all because their attention is glued to the ball. What stands out grabs focus, but salience is not the same as importance. Bright colors, loud sounds, striking details, these dominate perception, while subtler truths go unseen. Politicians use salience to highlight dramatic issues while hiding less visible problems. Marketers use it to make certain features shine, distracting from weaknesses. Salience directs not only attention but judgment, giving weight to what is noticeable rather than what is meaningful. And from here we step into another essential discovery, uno más que se suma a nuestra colección, neglect of probability. Human beings are notoriously poor at weighing risks according to their actual likelihood. You may fear dying in a plane crash more than in a car accident, even though the latter is far more common. You may buy lottery tickets, dreaming of improbable winnings, while ignoring everyday risks with much higher chances. The brain responds to emotion and vividness, not to cold probability. As a result, people underprepare for likely dangers while overreacting to rare ones. Think of how these four traps interact. The availability heuristic makes vivid memories feel frequent. The fluency effect makes smooth statements feel true. Salience bias makes noticeable details feel important. Neglect of probability makes unlikely risks feel terrifying, and likely ones invisible. Together, they shape a world where perception diverges from reality, where memory and emotion outweigh mathematics. Philosophically, this cluster reveals a humbling truth. You do not live in the world as it is, but in the world as your mind paints it, and that painting is drawn not by evidence alone, but by ease, vividness, and emotion. The events you remember, the words you find easy, the details that shine brightly, the risks that frighten you, all of these become your truth. Yet truth in this sense is not reality, it is a story crafted by mental shortcuts. Awareness of these illusions allows you to resist them gently. When vivid news makes you fear, you can pause and ask, is this frequent or just memorable? When a phrase feels convincing, you can check if it is true, not just fluent. When a detail grabs your attention, you can ask if it is important or merely loud. When a risk feels overwhelming, you can compare it to real probabilities. Such small pauses return balance, reminding you that what feels real is not always what is true. And as we close this section, the path bends toward another form of distortion. If ease of memory and fluency can trick you, what happens when you begin to assume that others see the world exactly as you do, that your knowledge, your perspective, your reality must also be theirs? That is the illusion we will now step into, where consensus, projection, and false clarity quietly reshape your view of other minds. You walk into a room with an opinion you believe is common sense. Surely, you think, most people must agree with me. But then you discover that others see things differently, and the surprise unsettles you. Aquí nos encontramos con otro de nuestros grandes datos, the false consensus effect. This bias makes you assume that your own beliefs, preferences, or behaviors are more widely shared than they actually are. If you like a certain food, you overestimate how many others like it too. If you hold a political opinion, you imagine it is mainstream when it may be a minority view. The mind projects personal reality onto the collective, mistaking familiarity for consensus. Why does this happen? Because your social circle often reflects your own choices and views. If you surround yourself with people similar to you, it reinforces the illusion that everyone thinks the same way. The false consensus effect soothes the mind. It tells you that you belong, that your way of seeing is not lonely, but the danger is that it blinds you to diversity of thought, leaving you unprepared for disagreement. This leads naturally to another bias. YC merece ser reconocido como otro de los descubrimientos clave en nuestra serie, the curse of knowledge. Once you know something, it is almost impossible to imagine what it feels like not to know it. Teachers suffer this when explaining concepts, forgetting how confusing they seemed before. Experts fall into it when addressing beginners, assuming their audience shares a foundation they do not. The curse of knowledge narrows empathy, making you less able to bridge the gap between your mind and another's. Linked to this is another illusion worth marking as uno más de nuestros grandes datos, the illusion of asymmetric insight. You often believe you understand others better than they understand you. You think you can see into their motives, their weaknesses, their hidden layers, while your own inner world remains opaque to them. Studies show that people consistently rate their insight into friends or partners as deeper than the insight those people have into them. This asymmetry is an illusion. In truth, understanding is limited on both sides, but the belief in greater insight gives you a false sense of clarity and control in relationships. Finally, we come to another subtle trap. Que suma un eslabón más en esta cadena de timón, naive realism. This bias is the belief that you see the world objectively, as it truly is, while others who disagree are uninformed, irrational, or biased. It makes you trust your own perspective as reality itself, rather than as one of many possible interpretations. When two people look at the same event and draw different conclusions, naive realism tempts each to think, I see clearly, and they are mistaken. This illusion fuels conflict, because it replaces curiosity with certainty and dialogue with dismissal. Consider how these four illusions weave into one another. The false consensus effect convinces you that your views are widely shared. The curse of knowledge blinds you to what others do not know. The illusion of asymmetric insight assures you that you see into others better than they see into you, and naive realism seals it by telling you that your view is reality itself. Together, they create a fragile but powerful framework where your perspective feels universal, deeper, and more accurate than it truly is. Philosophically, this cluster of traps touches the heart of human misunderstanding. We live in separate minds, each convinced that its view is clear. The tragedy is that this conviction prevents us from seeing how partial and biased our perspectives are. Yet there is also beauty here, the recognition that each person lives in their own private universe, carrying illusions of clarity and consensus, invites humility. To see these biases is to remember that others are not blind, they are simply gazing from another angle. Awareness of these illusions does not dissolve them, but it softens their grip. When you feel certain that everyone agrees with you, you can pause and ask whether that belief is shaped by your circle. When you struggle to explain something, you can remember how it felt before you knew it. When you believe you understand someone better than they understand you, you can allow the possibility that the insight is mutual, not asymmetrical. And when you feel sure that your view is reality itself, you can remind yourself that reality is richer than any single perspective. And so we close this section with a question that deepens the journey. If the mind distorts how you see others, what happens when it also distorts how you see the past, making every outcome appear inevitable, every story feel obvious in hindsight? That is the illusion waiting just ahead. Think of a moment when something unexpected happened, a decision that failed, an event that surprised you. Looking back now, you may feel it was obvious all along, that the clues were there, that you should have seen it coming. Aquí encontramos otro de nuestros grandes datos, hindsight bias. This illusion makes past events appear more predictable than they were. After a sports team wins, you think, I knew they would. After a financial crash, people claim they saw the signs, but in truth, uncertainty was always present. The bias rewrites the past with a false sense of inevitability, making outcomes feel clearer than they were at the time. Why does this happen? Because the brain craves coherence. Once an outcome is known, the mind reshapes memory to fit it. The messy uncertainty of the past is edited away, replaced with a neat story that explains how things had to happen. Hindsight bias is comforting. It makes the world feel orderly, as if events unfold with logic instead of randomness. But it also distorts learning, because you underestimate how uncertain the future really is. From here, another illusion flows, en mir así señalado como otro de nuestros hallazgos en esta serie de 101, outcome bias. When judging a decision, you focus on its result rather than the reasoning behind it. If a risky choice leads to success, you praise it as wise. If the same decision leads to failure, you condemn it as foolish. But wisdom cannot be measured by outcomes alone, because outcomes are shaped by chance as well as choice. A reckless gamble that happens to win is not suddenly intelligent, and a cautious decision that meets bad luck is not suddenly wrong. Outcome bias hides the quality of decisions beneath the shadow of results. Linked to this is another distortion, que también merece ser nombrado como uno de nuestros grandes datos, survivorship bias. When you look at success stories, you often forget the failures that never made it into the picture. You admire entrepreneurs who became billionaires, forgetting the countless others who tried and failed. You study the strategies of surviving companies, ignoring the silent graveyard of those that collapsed. Survivorship bias makes success appear more common and more achievable than it truly is, because only the survivors are visible. This illusion fuels optimism, but also blinds you to the full truth of risk. And then we arrive at another trap, uno más que se suma a nuestra colección de 101, the narrative fallacy. Human beings have a deep need to tell stories. We link events into chains, weave causes into effects, and create arcs where chaos once lived. But in doing so, we often oversimplify. We tell ourselves that a career succeeded because of one key decision, or that a historical event unfolded because of a single leader's vision. The truth is always more complex, intertwined causes, countless accidents, invisible influences. Yet the narrative fallacy gives us comfort. It transforms disorder into story, randomness into meaning. We live in tales, not in raw facts. Consider how these four illusions intertwine. Hindsight bias convinces you the past was predictable. Outcome bias makes you judge decisions by results instead of reasoning. Survivorship bias makes success seem more visible than failure. And the narrative fallacy ties it all together into neat stories. Together, they create a version of history that feels logical, fair, and meaningful, but is often distorted, selective, and simplified. Philosophically, this cluster speaks to the fragility of memory and the hunger for story. Human beings cannot bear the thought that life is random, outcomes unpredictable, and meaning scarce, and so the mind obliges. It rewrites the past, judges by results, erases failures, and spins narratives. These illusions are not only errors, they are the threads of human culture. Without them, we might be paralyzed by uncertainty. With them, we find comfort, but at the cost of truth. Awareness can soften their grip. When you catch yourself saying, "I knew it all along," you can remind yourself of the uncertainty you felt in the moment. When judging a decision, you can separate the process from the outcome. When admiring success, you can ask about the invisible failures, and when listening to a story, you can remember that life is more complex than any tale. And so, as we step out of this section, a new question emerges. If your mind can distort the past to make it neat, how does it distort the present to make yourself look better than reality? That is the bias waiting ahead, where the self is cast as hero and failures are carefully reframed. When you succeed, it feels natural to take credit. When you fail, it feels just as natural to blame circumstances. Aquí nos encontramos con otro de nuestros grandes datos, the self-serving bias. This distortion makes you attribute your successes to your own abilities, while shifting failures onto external causes. If you perform well in an exam, you believe it is because you are smart and hard-working. If you perform poorly, you believe the test was unfair, the teacher too harsh, or the conditions inadequate. This bias protects your self-esteem, preserving a sense of competence and worth, yet it quietly bends truth, making your story about the world kinder to yourself than it is to others. This illusion is not inherently bad. In moderation, it helps maintain confidence, giving you the courage to try again after setbacks. But in excess, it distorts responsibility. It can prevent you from learning from mistakes, because the blame is always pushed outward, and it can strain relationships, because the same protective instinct that shields your self-image makes you appear blind to your own faults. From here we move to another distortion, uno más que se suma a nuestros diez, the fundamental attribution error. This bias makes you overestimate the role of personal traits in explaining others' behavior, while underestimating the role of context. If someone cuts you off in traffic, you assume they are rude, reckless, or selfish. Rarely do you consider that they may be rushing to an emergency, but when you yourself cut someone off, you know the context. You were distracted, late, or stressed. The fundamental attribution error creates asymmetry. You excuse your own actions with context, but judge others as if context didn't matter. Closely tied to this is another illusion worth marking como otro de nuestros grandes hallazgos, the actor-observer bias. While the fundamental attribution error focuses on others, the actor-observer bias covers both sides. As the actor in your own story, you see circumstances shaping your choices. As the observer of others, you see character shaping theirs. The difference is perspective. Standing inside your own life, you feel the weight of pressures, obstacles, and conditions. Standing outside another's life, you see only their behavior, stripped of its hidden causes. This bias can quietly erode empathy because it hides from you the invisible contexts in which others act. And then we reach another of our discoveries, uno más que completa este conjunto, self-handicapping. This bias appears when people create obstacles for themselves to protect self-esteem. Imagine a student who avoids studying so that if they fail, they can say it was due to lack of effort, not lack of ability, or an athlete who stays up late before a competition, preserving the excuse of fatigue if they lose. Self-handicapping provides a way to explain failure without threatening self-worth, but it also undermines performance. It is a paradox. In trying to shield the ego, the mind sets up barriers that make success less likely. Consider how these four traps intertwine. The self-serving bias makes you take credit and deflect blame. The fundamental attribution error makes you judge others harshly while excusing yourself. The actor-observer bias deepens the divide between perspectives, and self-handicapping builds excuses in advance to preserve dignity. Together, they weave a story where the self is always central, always defended, always given the benefit of the doubt. Philosophically, this cluster reflects a deep human truth. Identity is fragile, and the mind will protect it even at the cost of accuracy. To live is to construct a self-narrative, and these biases are the threads that stitch holes in the fabric of that story. They preserve dignity but also limit growth, for to grow requires admitting mistakes, seeing context fairly, and releasing the need to always appear competent. Awareness offers a gentler path. When you feel the urge to credit yourself fully for success, you can pause and acknowledge the role of luck, support, and circumstance. When you judge another harshly, you can ask, what pressures might I be blind to in their life? When you find yourself building excuses, you can notice whether you are protecting pride at the cost of opportunity. Each pause is a step toward humility, and humility opens the door to learning. And now, as this section closes, a deeper question arises. If the mind protects the self so fiercely, what happens when it extends that protection to the moral order of the universe itself? When it convinces you that people always get what they deserve, even when reality says otherwise? That is the illusion we are about to explore next. Deep down, most people want to believe the world is fair, that good deeds are rewarded, that bad actions are punished, that life distributes outcomes according to merit. Aquí tenemos otro de nuestros grandes datos, the just world hypothesis. This bias is the belief that the universe is morally balanced, that justice is woven into reality itself. It is why people sometimes say, everything happens for a reason, or they got what they deserved. The just world illusion comforts us because it makes life feel predictable. If the world is fair, then as long as we are good, we will be safe. But reality is not so neat. Misfortune strikes the innocent, and wrongdoing often goes unpunished. The just world hypothesis is less about truth and more about reassurance, a shield against the chaos of chance. This belief leads naturally into another trap. Uno más que merece un lugar en nuestra serie de 101, moral luck. Here the bias is subtler. People are judged not only by their intentions or efforts, but by the outcomes of their actions, even when those outcomes are shaped by luck. Imagine two drivers both texting while driving. One arrives safely, the other causes an accident. Even though their behavior was equally reckless, the one who caused harm will be judged more harshly because outcome colors moral judgment. Moral luck reveals how we often confuse chance with character, punishing or praising, not just what was done, but what happened to follow. From here we step into another illusion. You see, debemos subrayarlo como otro de nuestros grandes datos, defensive attribution. This bias makes people assign more blame to victims of accidents or misfortunes, especially when they fear they themselves could face the same situation. For example, when hearing about an accident, observers may blame the victim. They weren't careful enough, as a way of reassuring themselves that they would avoid the same fate. Defensive attribution protects us from vulnerability. By believing that victims are partly responsible, we convince ourselves that we are safer than we are. Yet this illusion adds cruelty to tragedy, as it shifts responsibility onto those already suffering. Closely tied to this is another bias, uno más que sumamos a nuestro recorrido, blaming the victim. This occurs when people assume that those who suffer misfortune must have done something to deserve it. A person robbed must have been careless. A person sick must have made poor choices. A person struggling in poverty must not have worked hard enough. Blaming the victim grows out of the just world hypothesis, because if the world is fair, then victims must have caused their suffering somehow. This illusion provides psychological comfort, but it distorts reality and deepens injustice, adding blame where compassion is needed. Consider how these four traps connect. The just world hypothesis convinces you that life is fair. Moral luck ties morality to chance outcomes. Defensive attribution shifts blame toward victims to protect yourself, and blaming the victim seals the circle, turning suffering into supposed fault. Together, they create a worldview that feels ordered but is often harsh and inaccurate. Philosophically, these illusions speak to humanity's longing for justice. We want to believe in fairness so deeply that we create it in our minds, even when reality contradicts it. These biases are not only errors, they are coping mechanisms. They allow us to face a chaotic world without drowning in fear, but they also blind us to true compassion. When we cling to the illusion of fairness, we may fail to see suffering as it is, undeserved, unpredictable, part of the fragile condition of being human. Awareness offers a gentler perspective. When you notice the just world assumption, you can remind yourself that life is not always fair, and that this makes kindness more urgent, not less. When moral luck tempts you to judge outcomes instead of choices, you can separate intention from accident. When defensive attribution whispers that victims are to blame, you can see the fear behind that whisper and choose empathy instead. And when you catch yourself blaming the victim, you can pause, remember the randomness of life, and soften judgment with compassion. And now, as this section closes, the path shifts again. If the mind invents fairness where none exists, how does it behave when faced with pure randomness, when chance itself becomes tangled in illusions of patterns and destiny? That is the realm we enter next, where probability bends under the weight of human belief. Imagine a coin tossed 5 times in a row, and each time it lands on heads. As the coin flips again, many people feel that tails is due, as if probability had a memory. Aquí tenemos otro de nuestros grandes datos, the gambler's fallacy. This bias convinces you that past random events influence future ones, when in reality each toss is independent. The coin has no memory, yet the mind insists on balance. Casinos thrive on this illusion. A roulette wheel shows a streak of red, and players rush to bet on black, believing the universe will correct itself. But randomness does not work that way. Each spin, each toss, each roll begins fresh, unaffected by history. Why does the gambler's fallacy feel so convincing? Because the human brain is built to detect patterns. In daily life, patterns matter. Seasons change, cause follows effect, habits repeat. So when randomness produces streaks, the mind cannot accept them as chance. It demands order. The gambler's fallacy is the mind's desperate attempt to impose balance on chaos. From here we move to another illusion. Uno más que se suma a nuestra serie de 101, regression to the mean. This bias occurs when extreme performances or outcomes are naturally followed by more average ones, yet we misinterpret the change as meaningful. For example, an athlete who plays exceptionally well one day is likely to perform closer to average the next, not because of a curse, but because extreme events are rare and tend to return to normal levels. Yet people create stories around this. Coaches think their criticism caused improvement, when in fact performance simply regressed to the mean. Students believe their study habits failed them, when grades naturally oscillate around an average. Regression is statistical inevitability, but the mind interprets it as cause and effect. Closely tied to this is another trap worth highlighting, como otro de nuestros grandes hallazgos, the law of small numbers. This bias makes you believe that small samples of data are representative of larger patterns, even when they are not. Imagine flipping a coin 5 times and seeing 3 heads. The mind may conclude the coin is biased, forgetting that small samples often deviate from the true average. People generalize from brief experiences. One rude waiter defines an entire restaurant. One bad day at work defines a whole job. One friendly stranger defines a city. The law of small numbers magnifies chance fluctuations into supposed truths. And finally, we come to another of our discoveries, uno más que refuerza la colección, the Monte Carlo fallacy. This is a specific version of the gambler's fallacy, named after a famous incident in the Monte Carlo casino in 1913. That night, the roulette wheel landed on black 26 times in a row. Players lost fortunes betting on red, convinced that a switch was inevitable, but the wheel has no memory. Each spin remains independent. The fallacy is not just statistical, it is emotional. After many repetitions, the pressure to believe in reversal grows almost unbearable. The Monte Carlo fallacy demonstrates how randomness can drive human belief into collective delusion. These 4 traps, gambler's fallacy, regression to the mean, the law of small numbers, and the Monte Carlo fallacy, reveal how fragile our understanding of chance really is. We see patterns where none exist, invent causes for natural fluctuations, and mistake small samples for certainty. Randomness, which should be simple, becomes twisted by our need for order and explanation. Philosophically, this cluster of illusions reflects humanity's struggle with chaos. We crave meaning, and so we weave stories into the roll of dice and the spin of wheels. We cannot bear the idea that life events may be entirely unconnected, that fortune and failure may arrive without reason. These biases are errors, yes, but they are also attempts to create comfort in the face of uncertainty. Awareness provides a gentler way forward. When tempted to think a coin owes you a tail, you can remember independence. When extreme success or failure shifts back toward normal, you can see regression instead of magic. When small samples tempt you to generalize, you can pause and ask whether the evidence is enough. And when long streaks lure you into belief, you can remind yourself that probability does not keep records. And as this section draws to a close, another question emerges. If the mind distorts randomness so powerfully, what happens when emotions themselves become the guiding compass, when feelings disguise themselves as logic, leading choices in directions reason never planned? That is the next terrain we are about to enter. When you face a decision, you may think you are weighing facts carefully, but often your emotions are quietly steering the outcome. Aquí aparece otro de nuestros grandes datos, the affect heuristic. This bias makes you rely on your immediate emotional reaction as a shortcut for judgment. If something feels good, you judge it as less risky. If it feels bad, you see it as more dangerous. For example, when people are in a positive mood, they are more likely to invest, take risks, and trust others. When they are fearful, they see higher risks everywhere. The affect heuristic shows that feelings are not only companions to thought, they often take the driver's seat, while reason rides quietly in the back. From here, the illusion deepens. and merece ser reconocido como otro de nuestros descubrimientos. Emotional reasoning. This bias occurs when you believe something is true, simply because you feel it strongly. Anxiety makes you think danger is near, even if no evidence supports it. Guilt convinces you that you must have done something wrong. Sadness colors the world gray, convincing you that life itself has lost meaning. Emotional reasoning transforms inner states into outer truths, blurring the boundary between feeling and fact. This brings us to another distortion. Y sí, lo destacamos como uno más de nuestros grandes datos en esta serie de 101, mood congruent recall. Your current emotional state shapes what memories come to mind. When you are happy, you remember other joyful moments. When you are sad, your mind fills with past sorrows. The brain acts like a curator, selecting memories that match the mood of the present. This bias can deepen emotions, happiness reinforced by happy memories, sadness weighed down by sad ones. In this way, moods create self-perpetuating cycles, pulling the past into the present to confirm what you already feel. And then we come to another illusion worth marking como otro de nuestros grandes hallazgos, the impact bias. This bias makes you overestimate the intensity and duration of your emotional reactions to future events. You believe that winning a prize will make you happy for months, or that losing a job will make you miserable forever. In reality, emotions fade more quickly than expected, a process called hedonic adaptation. Studies show that people who win the lottery are not significantly happier in the long term than those who do not, and those who experience setbacks often recover faster than predicted. The impact bias shows that the future you imagine emotionally is often much more extreme than the future you will actually experience. Taken together, these 4 traps reveal how emotions quietly infiltrate every stage of thought. The affect heuristic makes feelings the shortcut to judgment. Emotional reasoning transforms feelings into supposed truths. Mood congruent recall reinforces the present with matching memories, and the impact bias exaggerates the future, making imagined joy brighter and imagined pain darker than reality. Philosophically, these illusions speak to the deep intertwining of heart and mind. We often imagine reason and emotion as separate forces, one logical, the other irrational, but the truth is more subtle. They are braided together, influencing each other constantly. The mind cannot escape emotion, nor should it. Feelings add color to life, motivate action, and give meaning to experience. The trap lies in mistaking emotion for truth itself. Awareness of these biases allows you to pause gently when emotions rise. When fear makes risks look larger, you can ask whether the danger is real or felt. When guilt insists you are wrong, you can test whether evidence agrees. When sadness summons memories of sorrow, you can remember that other memories exist, waiting for another mood to call them forward. And when imagining the future, you can remind yourself that feelings will fade, that joy and pain both soften with time. These insights invite humility. They remind you that what feels overwhelming now may not feel the same tomorrow, and what seems inevitable in emotion may be less certain in fact. They allow you to treat your feelings with respect, listening to them, but not bowing to them as ultimate truth. And so, as we close this section, we step toward another force that bends judgment, not through inner emotion, but through outer influence. If your feelings can shape truth, what happens when the crowd, the group, the authority figure around you quietly shapes it as well? That is the question we are about to explore as we enter the world of social proof and conformity. Imagine walking down a street and seeing a crowd gathered around a shop window. Even if you don't know what they are looking at, curiosity pulls you closer. This instinct is not random, it is uno de nuestros grandes datos, social proof. The bias makes you assume that if many people are doing something, it must be correct, safe, or valuable. Restaurants with long lines seem better. Online posts with thousands of likes seem more trustworthy. Social proof simplifies decision-making, letting the group guide your choices, but it also blinds you to the fact that the group can be wrong and that popularity does not equal truth. From this bias grows another, uno más, que merece ser destacado en nuestra lista de 101, the bandwagon effect. This trap makes you adopt beliefs or behaviors simply because others are adopting them. Political movements swell as more people join. Fashion trends spread not because of their merit, but because of their visibility. Investments rise in value as more investors pile in, creating bubbles that eventually burst. The bandwagon effect gives a powerful sense of belonging, but it also turns individuality into conformity. The more people jump on board, the harder it feels to resist. But groups are not only about following, they are also about suppressing dissent. Aquí aparece otra de nuestros grandes hallazgos, groupthink. In tightly knit groups, the desire for harmony can silence disagreement. Members suppress doubts to maintain unity, leading to flawed decisions. History is full of examples, governments, businesses, and even families choosing dangerous paths because no one wanted to break the illusion of agreement. Groupthink feels safe because it preserves belonging, but it sacrifices truth and creativity. The silence of one voice can ripple into the blindness of many. And then comes another illusion, uno más que se suma a nuestra colección, authority bias. When a figure of authority gives an opinion, people are more likely to accept it without question. Doctors, leaders, teachers, or even celebrities wield influence that shapes judgment. Classic experiments have shown how ordinary people obey authority, even when asked to perform actions that conflict with their conscience. Authority bias smooths the path of compliance, making us trust the powerful more than the evidence. It provides order, but also creates vulnerability, as obedience can override critical thought. Finally, we arrive at another distortion, uno más dentro de los 10 in-group bias. This bias makes you favor those who belong to your group, your nation, team, religion, or community, while judging outsiders more harshly. Even when groups are assigned randomly, people show favoritism toward their own. In-group bias fuels loyalty and solidarity, but it also feeds prejudice, discrimination, and conflict. It narrows empathy, making kindness conditional on membership. Consider how these 5 traps connect. Social proof makes you follow the crowd. The bandwagon effect accelerates that following into movements. Groupthink silences dissent inside the group. Authority bias enforces obedience to leaders. In-group bias divides the world into us and them. Together, they form a map of how social forces bend individual thought. What feels like independent judgment often arises from invisible pressures, whispers of conformity, and the pull of belonging. Philosophically, these biases remind us that humans are not only individuals, but also deeply social creatures. To belong is to survive, and so the mind bends toward conformity. These illusions are not weaknesses, they are the cost of community. They allow cooperation, trust, and unity, but they also risk turning truth into consensus, morality into obedience, and empathy into tribalism. Awareness offers balance. When you see a crowd, you can pause and ask whether their behavior is truly wise. When tempted to join the bandwagon, you can check whether belief comes from reason or from numbers. When harmony silences you, you can remember the value of dissent. When authority speaks, you can weigh evidence as well as power. And when in-group loyalty arises, you can ask whether kindness can extend beyond borders. And as this section closes, we prepare to step into another form of distortion. If social pressures can bend judgment, what happens when time itself becomes the bias, when the present moment overshadows the future, when urgency blinds you to patience? That is the question awaiting us next. Imagine being offered a choice: receive $50 today or $60 a month from now. Many people take the smaller, immediate reward. Aquí aparece otro de nuestros grandes datos, hyperbolic discounting. This bias makes you undervalue the future compared to the present. The reward that arrives now feels disproportionately more satisfying than the larger one later. The shape of this distortion is not linear, it is steep and sudden, like a drop-off. We give too much weight to immediacy and too little to patience. That is why diets are broken for desserts, savings are neglected for spending, and long-term goals collapse under the weight of short-term pleasures. From here, another illusion unfolds. Uno más que merece estar en nuestra serie de 101. Present bias. While hyperbolic discounting explains the steepness of preference for now over later, present bias describes the everyday tendency to favor immediate gratification, even when the future cost is clear. You know that staying up late will make tomorrow harder, but the comfort of the present moment wins. You know that skipping exercise will weaken your body, but the pull of rest dominates. Present bias bends your timeline inward, anchoring you in the now, as if the future self were a stranger whose well-being does not matter as much. Linked to these is another distortion. Sí, debemos destacarlo como otro de nuestros grandes datos, time inconsistency. This occurs when the preferences you hold for the future shift once that future becomes the present. Today you plan to start a diet next week. When the week arrives, the plan weakens in the face of cravings. Today you intend to save money next month. When the month arrives, something else feels more urgent. Time inconsistency shows how fragile intention is when confronted with the present moment. Plans made by the rational self are undone by the impulsive self, and the two selves rarely agree. And then we come to another bias. Uno más que enriquece nuestra colección de 101, projection bias. This distortion makes you assume that your current preferences and feelings will remain the same in the future. When you are full, you underestimate how hungry you will be later. When you are calm, you underestimate how strong your anger or fear may become. Projection bias makes you think your present state is permanent, when in reality, emotions, desires, and needs shift constantly. This illusion makes planning fragile, because you plan for a future self that does not exist. Taken together, these four traps reveal how time itself is twisted by the mind. Hyperbolic discounting makes the present loom too large. Present bias favors now at the cost of later. Time inconsistency reveals the battle between the planning self and the acting self, and projection bias makes you mistake the present for permanence. The result is a life tilted toward immediacy, where future well-being is sacrificed to present desire. Philosophically, these biases point to the deepest paradox of human life. We live only in the present, yet we must prepare for the future. The future is always abstract, distant, intangible, while the present is vivid, sensory, undeniable. The biases of time reflect the struggle between these two realities. To live too much in the now is to neglect what is coming. To live too much for the future is to miss the richness of the moment. The art of life lies in balancing both, yet the brain is tilted heavily toward now. Awareness can soften this tilt. When a choice tempts you, you can pause and imagine your future self as vividly as your present self. You can ask, what will tomorrow's version of me feel about this? When plans fade in the face of action, you can remember that the planning self and the acting self are both you, and both need respect. When current moods distort your vision of the future, you can remind yourself that change is inevitable, and that the future self will not be identical to the present one. And so, as this section closes, the path bends once again. If the mind can distort time so profoundly, what happens when it distorts truth itself, when repetition and familiarity begin to feel like proof? That is the illusion we are about to uncover next, where the sheer echo of ideas becomes their validation. You hear a statement once, and it feels neutral. You hear it twice, and it starts to sound familiar. You hear it many times, and suddenly, it feels true. Aquí tenemos otra de nuestros grandes datos, the illusory truth effect. This bias makes repetition itself a signal of credibility. A phrase, even if false, becomes believable the more it is repeated. This is why propaganda works, why advertising slogans stick, and why rumors spread. The brain equates familiarity with accuracy, because processing familiar information feels easier, and ease is mistaken for truth. From here we step into another illusion. Uno más que merece estar en nuestra serie de 101, the mere exposure effect. This bias makes you develop a preference for things simply because you encounter them often. A song you didn't like at first becomes pleasant after hearing it many times. A face you see repeatedly feels more trustworthy. A brand that appears again and again feels safer to choose. The mere exposure effect explains why repetition in marketing is powerful. The more we see something, the more we like it, not because it has changed, but because our mind has grown accustomed to it. But repetition does not always persuade, it can also backfire. Aquí aparece otro de nuestros hallazgos importantes, the familiarity backfire effect. When false information has been repeated, and later corrected, the repetition itself can still make the falsehood feel true. Efforts to debunk myths sometimes strengthen them, because the correction repeats the false claim in order to refute it. For example, if you hear repeatedly that a certain vaccine is unsafe, even when followed by a correction, the phrase lingers and the mind recalls the claim more than the denial. Familiarity backfire shows how sticky repetition can be, making corrections fragile against falsehoods. And then we encounter another distortion. Uno más que enriquece la colección de 101. Repetition bias. This is the broader tendency to give greater weight to information simply because it has been repeated, regardless of its content. In conversations, people repeat arguments, and the mind treats them as stronger. In news cycles, repeated stories dominate attention, regardless of importance. In debates, a point said often begins to overshadow points said once, even if the once spoken point carries more evidence. Repetition is mistaken for evidence, echo for reality. Taken together, these four traps, illusory truth effect, mere exposure effect, familiarity backfire, and repetition bias, reveal how the mind is hypnotized by echoes. What is repeated becomes real. What is familiar becomes safe. What is echoed becomes convincing. The brain was not built for constant bombardment of information, and so it relies on shortcuts. Familiarity equals truth. Repetition equals weight. Echoes equal reality. Philosophically, this cluster speaks to the vulnerability of human belief. We are creatures of stories and songs, of rhythms and patterns. Repetition comforts us, but it also deceives. It is why ideologies can spread like fire, why lies can travel faster than corrections, why entire cultures can be shaped by the rhythm of words. These biases are not only errors, they are the price of living in a world where memory and fluency guide trust. Awareness offers a shield. When you notice that something feels true simply because you've heard it many times, you can pause and ask, is it familiar, or is it factual? When you find yourself liking a product more simply because you've seen it often, you can separate comfort from quality. When corrections feel weaker than falsehoods, you can remember the trick of repetition, and when debates echo the same points again and again, you can look for substance, not just frequency. These illusions remind us that truth is not always what is loudest or most familiar. Sometimes truth whispers only once, while falsehood shouts many times. To listen carefully is to resist the power of repetition. And now, as this section closes, the journey nears its end. If repetition can distort truth, what happens when the final illusion lies not in facts or groups or time, but in the very act of self-reflection, when the mind convinces itself that it is less biased than others? That is the final trap we must face. You may believe that if you look inward, you will see your mind clearly, like staring into a mirror, but here aparece otro de nuestros grandes datos, the introspection illusion. This bias makes you think that you understand the roots of your own thoughts and decisions, when in fact much of your mind's activity remains hidden. People often explain their choices as if they were deliberate, even when experiments show they were influenced by factors they never noticed. You might say you bought a shirt because of its color, when the real reason was the music in the store. You might claim you liked a story because of the plot, when it was the rhythm of the language that held you. The introspection illusion reassures you that you know yourself, but the truth is subtler. The mind is a mystery even to itself. From here, another distortion emerges. Uno más que suma a nuestra colección de 101, blind spot bias. This is the tendency to believe that others are more biased than you are. You recognize distortions in their reasoning, their illusions, their shortcuts, yet you overlook the same distortions in yourself. In studies, people consistently rate themselves as less biased than average, convinced of their own objectivity. The irony is sharp. The very belief that you are unbiased is itself a bias. The blind spot closes your awareness, leaving you less willing to question your own perspective. Linked to this is another trap worth naming, claramente como otro de nuestros grandes datos, metacognition error. This occurs when you believe you already understand your own biases, and therefore assume you are immune to them. The knowledge of bias becomes a shield, but a false one. For example, someone who knows about confirmation bias may think, I am careful, so I don't fall for that. Yet the bias still operates, subtly shaping attention and memory. To know a trap exists does not mean you have escaped it. The mind deceives not only through ignorance, but also through the illusion of knowledge. These final biases close the circle of our journey. They are not about how you see the world, but about how you see yourself. They show that even self-reflection is vulnerable, that even the effort to escape bias can create another bias. The introspection illusion makes you trust your self-knowledge too much. The blind spot bias makes you think you are clearer than others. The metacognition error makes you think knowledge alone grants immunity. Together, they remind us that the greatest trap is believing you are free from traps. Philosophically, these last illusions invite humility. To be human is to be biased, to see through a lens, to live in a world painted by shortcuts of thought. But humility does not mean despair. Awareness, even if imperfect, widens perspective. To notice that you do not know yourself fully is already a deeper form of knowing. To admit bias is already a way of loosening its grip. To carry the possibility of error is to walk more gently, more openly, more curiously through life. And so we arrive at the end of our 101 discoveries. Each one is a small mirror, reflecting the mind's hidden workings. Together, they reveal not a broken machine, but a deeply human one, built for survival, for meaning, for comfort, for belonging. These biases are errors, yes, but they are also adaptations. They protect as much as they deceive, guide as much as they mislead. Awareness is not about erasing them, but about softening their control. When you recognize a bias, you gain a pause, and in that pause, there is freedom, the freedom to question, to choose, to see a little more clearly. And as this final section closes, we slow down, preparing for a softer rhythm, for if the mind is full of traps, it is also full of wonders, and knowing both perhaps is the gentlest escape. And now the journey draws to its gentle end. 101 hidden traps of thought, each unveiled one by one, have led us here. You have walked through illusions of memory, of emotion, of control, of time, of self and of society, each bias a mirror, each discovery a quiet lantern held up to the night of the mind. Let yourself breathe into the space of knowing, not rushed, not hurried, not pressured to remember it all, simply holding the impression that the mind is vast, that it bends and shapes reality in ways both surprising and deeply human. You do not need to fight these biases, for they are part of the architecture of thought. Instead, you can notice them with tenderness, as you would notice waves on water, patterns in clouds, or shifting winds across a quiet field. Every illusion you learned about was not just an error, but a reminder of what it means to be alive. To seek patterns even where none exist is to long for meaning. To prefer the present over the future is to love the vividness of now. To believe in fairness is to hope for justice, even when the world is uneven. To overvalue your own perspective is to carry the unavoidable weight of being only one mind among many. These traps are not flaws alone, they are also evidence of the beauty and fragility of human thought. And so the path slows. You have reached the end of the circle, where awareness itself becomes the soft reward. Nothing to solve, nothing to prove, only the quiet recognition that knowing the mind's tricks makes you a little freer, a little wiser, a little calmer. Let this knowledge settle into you, not as urgency, but as a gentle presence, a reminder that every thought is both a window and a veil, both a light and a shadow, and that awareness, quiet awareness, is enough.